February 1942. The knock came early, before dawn had fully broken over the Sacramento Valley. Maz Nakamura heard it first, a sharp rapping that cut through the cold morning air like a blade. He was already awake, had been awake most of the night, staring at the ceiling of the farmhouse his father had built 30 years earlier. The knock wasn't a surprise. For 3 months since December 7th, he had been waiting for it. What surprised him was how polite it sounded. 3 measured raps, patient, almost apologetic, as if the men on the other side of the door were there to deliver mail, not to destroy his life. His wife, Hannah, stirred beside him. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. In the darkness, he felt her hand find his, her fingers cold and trembling. From down the hall came the sound of his children waking, confused voices asking questions in whispers. Maz rose slowly, pulled on his work pants and a flannel shirt, the same clothes he wore every morning to walk his fields. But this morning, he wouldn't be checking the strawberry rows or inspecting the new growth on the pear trees his father had planted in 1912. This morning, he would open the door to find 2 men in dark suits, holding clipboards and wearing expressions that managed to be both sympathetic and utterly indifferent. "Your family's on the list," one of them said. "You have 10 days to settle your affairs." Settle your affairs. The words hung in the air like smoke. Maz looked past the men, out toward the fields that stretched in neat rows toward the horizon. 80 acres of the most fertile soil in California, land that had been hardpan clay and sagebrush when his father, Ichiro, first arrived in 1903. 40 years of labor had transformed it into one of the most productive farms in the valley. Strawberries, pears, vegetables that supplied markets from Sacramento to San Francisco. The trees alone were worth a fortune, each one carefully grafted, pruned, and tended through decades of seasons. The irrigation system Maz had installed himself, digging trenches by hand, laying pipe, engineering water flow that could keep the entire farm green even in the driest summers. The packing shed, the equipment, the truck, the house with its wide porch where his children played in the evenings. 10 days to sell it all. 10 days to dismantle a legacy built over 4 decades. 10 days before they would be forced onto buses heading to places with names they didn't yet know. Manzanar, Tule Lake, Heart Mountain. Places that sounded like poetry but would prove to be prisons. The men handed him a stack of papers, instructions, regulations, maps. There was a phone number to call, an office where he could register his property, a list of approved buyers. Maz didn't need to read the list to know what it meant. Approved buyers, white buyers, men who had been his neighbors, his competitors, his customers, men who had smiled at him at church socials and then gone home to complain about the Japanese taking over California agriculture, men who were already driving past his farm slowly, appraising, calculating, waiting. After the officials left, Maz stood on his porch and watched the sun rise over the fields. It was the same sun that had risen every morning of his life, but somehow it looked different now. Harsher, less forgiving. Behind him, inside the house, Hana was trying to explain to their 3 children what was happening. Kenji, 14, kept asking why. Yuki, 11, was crying quietly. Little Tomo, only 6, didn't understand any of it. He wanted to know if they could take his dog. Could they take the chickens? What about his bicycle? "No," Hana said softly. "We can only take what we can carry." By mid-morning, the first car pulled into the driveway. Maz recognized it immediately. Bill Henderson, who owned the farm 2 miles down the road. They'd known each other for 15 years, had traded equipment, helped each other during harvests, shared coffee and conversation 100 times. Bill stepped out of his truck, removing his hat as he approached. His face carried an expression Maz couldn't quite read. Shame, perhaps, or maybe just determination wrapped in a thin veneer of regret. "Maz," Bill said quietly, "I heard the news. I'm real sorry about this." Maz nodded but said nothing. He knew what was coming. "I know this ain't easy," Bill continued, his eyes fixed on the ground between them. "But I was thinking, if you gotta sell, better to sell to someone you know than to strangers. I could take the farm off your hands, give you a fair price, considering the circumstances." Fair price. Maz felt something cold settle in his chest. He had paid $18,000 for this land in 1928, back when it was still mostly undeveloped. He'd spent another $10,000 on improvements, equipment, trees. The farm was worth at least $40,000 now, probably more. Before December 7th, he'd been approached by buyers offering $50,000. That was 2 months ago. A different world ago. "What are you offering?" Maz asked, his voice flat. Bill shuffled his feet, looked away toward the fields. "Well, considering you need to sell quick, and considering how things are right now, I was thinking maybe $5,000. Cash. Today. $5,000 for $40,000 worth of land, trees, and equipment." Maz felt his hands ball into fists at his sides. But what could he do? Refuse? Hold out for a better offer that would never come? The banks had frozen all Japanese accounts the week after Pearl Harbor. He couldn't access his own money, couldn't negotiate, couldn't hire a lawyer even if lawyers would take his case. In 10 days, he would be on a bus. The farm would sit empty. The county would seize it for unpaid taxes, or the state would auction it off, or it would simply be absorbed into a white neighbor's property through some legal mechanism. Maz didn't fully understand, but knew he was powerless to stop. "I need to think about it," Maz said finally. Bill nodded, put his hat back on. "You do that. But don't think too long. I hear there's others interested. You wait too long, price might go down." After Bill left, 3 more neighbors came. Then a stranger from Sacramento who said he was a property speculator. Then another stranger who didn't even bother with introductions, just walked around the farm with a notebook, writing things down, before offering $3,000 for everything. "Take it or leave it," he said. "Price drops every day you wait." By evening, Maz sat at his kitchen table surrounded by offers scrawled on scraps of paper. The highest was $5,500. The lowest was $2,000. For a farm worth $40,000, for 4 decades of his father's life. For every morning his family had woken before dawn to tend the fields. For every harvest, every season, every drop of sweat soaked into California soil. Hannah stood behind him, her hand on his shoulder. "What will we do?" she asked. Maz didn't answer. He didn't have an answer. All across California, the same scene was repeating itself. In the Salinas Valley, in Fresno, in the Central Valley, in the coastal regions, Japanese-American families were opening their doors to find men with cash and contracts, offering dimes on the dollar for properties worth fortunes. The timing wasn't coincidental. Everyone knew that Japanese Americans had built agricultural empires in California. By 1942, they controlled a staggering percentage of the state's produce. Though they represented less than 2% of California's population, Japanese farmers produced over 30% of the state's commercial crops. They grew 90% of the snap beans, 50% of the celery, 40% of the tomatoes. They had turned California into America's garden, and white farmers had watched with growing resentment for decades. The bitterness had been building long before Pearl Harbor. Japanese immigrants were too successful, too hard-working, too willing to labor from dawn until midnight to make barren land bloom. They bought property that white farmers dismissed as worthless, then through backbreaking effort and ingenious irrigation, made it profitable. They undercut prices not through exploitation, but through efficiency. They formed cooperatives, shared resources, helped each other succeed. And white California hated them for it. The alien land laws had tried to stop them, laws passed in 1913 and 1920 that prohibited Asian immigrants from owning property. But Japanese families found ways around the restrictions, putting land in the names of their American-born children, forming corporations, using creative legal structures. They persisted. They prospered, and that prosperity became proof, in the eyes of white farmers and politicians, of something sinister. Success became evidence of conspiracy. When Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7, 1941, the anti-Japanese sentiment that had simmered for decades boiled over instantly. Within hours, FBI agents were rounding up community leaders, priests, teachers, anyone with ties to Japanese organizations. Bank accounts were frozen, businesses were raided, and the whisper campaigns began. They're spies, they're saboteurs, they're loyal to the emperor. Every Japanese face became an enemy face, regardless of citizenship, regardless of generation, regardless of the fact that not a single act of sabotage or espionage was ever proven against Japanese Americans on the West Coast. The pressure built through January and February of 1942. Newspapers ran hysterical editorials, politicians gave speeches about the Yellow Peril, citizens' committees formed demanding action, and behind it all, barely concealed, was the land hunger. White farmers and businessmen saw an opportunity, and they took it. They wrote letters to congressmen, testified at hearings, appeared on radio programs, all with the same message. The Japanese are dangerous, they must be removed, and oh, by the way, something will need to be done with all that valuable farmland they're sitting on. On February 19, 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. The language was bureaucratic, almost boring. It authorized military commanders to designate areas from which any persons may be excluded. It never mentioned Japanese Americans by name. It didn't need to. Everyone understood exactly what it meant. 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, 2/3 of them American citizens, would be removed from the West Coast and imprisoned in camps scattered across the interior of the country. They would be given days or weeks to pack up their lives. Everything they couldn't carry would have to be sold, stored, or abandoned. The panic was immediate and absolute. Families had no time to plan, no time to negotiate, no access to their own bank accounts to cushion the blow. They had to sell, and they had to sell immediately, and everyone knew it. The vultures descended. Not just neighbors and competitors, but professional speculators who traveled from farm to farm with cash and contracts. Furniture dealers offering $5 for entire households. Equipment brokers paying scrap metal prices for tractors worth thousands. Used car lots giving $50 for vehicles worth $500. And through it all, the betrayals. The neighbor who'd borrowed sugar last month now offering $200 for a farm worth $20,000. The business partner suddenly discovering a clause in their contract that let him buy out his Japanese associate for a fraction of the company's value. The family friend who'd been trusted to hold property now claiming he'd actually purchased it years ago, producing documents that may or may not have been forged. And who could challenge him? The courts were closed to Japanese plaintiffs. The lawyers wouldn't take their cases. The police shrugged and said there was nothing they could do. Maz Nakamura held out for 4 days before accepting Bill Henderson's offer. Not the original $5,000, but $4,500. After Bill came back and said that was his final offer, take it or leave it, and honestly, Maz, you should be grateful anyone's willing to buy it all. Maz signed the papers on the hood of Bill's truck, his hand shaking so badly he could barely write his name. Bill counted out the cash, mostly in small bills, and drove away without looking back. That night, Maz stood in his fields one last time, running his hands over the bark of a pear tree his father had planted when Maz was just a boy. The tree was 30 years old, full-grown, strong. It would produce fruit for decades more, but not for his family, not for his children. Bill Henderson's children would harvest these pears. Bill Henderson's grandchildren would someday stand in this field and never know that it had been built by Japanese hands, Japanese sweat, Japanese dreams. The Nakamura family spent their final days sorting through possessions. What could they take? Only what they could carry. 2 suitcases per person, clothing, toiletries, a few photographs. Everything else had to go. Hana sold her piano for $20. Kenji's bicycle went for $2. The furniture, the dishes, the tools, the family's entire library of books, all of it sold to dealers who showed up with trucks and empty eyes, loading up other people's lives and driving away to resell it all for profit. The dog was given to a neighbor who promised to take care of it, but who Maz suspected would probably shoot it once they were gone. The chickens were butchered and given away. 40 years of accumulation reduced to 8 suitcases and $4,500 in cash that would have to somehow sustain a family of 5 for an unknown number of years in an unknown place. On the morning of March 1st, 1942, the Nakamura family walked away from their farm. They didn't look back. Looking back would have broken something inside them that needed to stay intact if they were going to survive what was coming. Behind them, Bill Henderson was already moving into the farmhouse, already giving orders to the workers he'd hired to harvest the strawberries that Maz had planted. The farm would continue. The trees would bloom, the profits would flow, but the Nakamuras would never see any of it again. They were being erased from the land they had created, written out of the story of California agriculture, disappeared from the prosperity they had built with their own hands. And the terrible truth, the one that burned in Maz's chest as the bus carried his family away from everything they knew, was that it was all perfectly legal. Every signature, every contract, every theft wrapped in paperwork and stamped with official seals. They called it evacuation. They called it relocation. They called it military necessity. But Maz Nakamura knew what to call it. He just couldn't say the word out loud yet, not in front of his children, not while there was still a long road ahead and only God knew what waited at the end of it. They called it evacuation, as if they were being rescued from danger. But the only danger was the one their own government had created. And behind every polite word, every official form, was a simple truth: theft wrapped in the language of national security. The mathematics of what happened in the spring of 1942 tell a story that no amount of official language can obscure. Across California, Oregon, and Washington, Japanese-American families controlled agricultural assets valued at approximately $400 million. That's $400 million in 1942 dollars, equivalent to roughly $7 billion today. They owned farms, nurseries, fishing boats, produce markets, hotels, restaurants, and import businesses. They had bank accounts, insurance policies, vehicles, equipment, and homes filled with the accumulation of decades of work. When the evacuation orders came, all of it had to be liquidated immediately. And when you have to sell everything you own in a matter of days, with no access to your bank accounts, no ability to negotiate, and no legal recourse, the buyers set the price. The numbers are almost impossible to believe, but they're documented in government records, in letters, in the careful accounts kept by families who couldn't quite accept what was happening to them. A farm in Florin, California, purchased for $25,000 in 1936, sold for $350 in March 1942. A commercial strawberry operation in Gardena, worth $40,000, sold for $1,200. A 30-acre pear orchard in the Sacramento Valley, valued at $32,000, purchased by a white neighbor for $400. Tractors worth $2,000 sold for $10. Entire households of furniture sold for $20. New automobiles sold for $50. Refrigerators, washing machines, farming equipment, livestock, all of it liquidated at prices that would have been insulting if they hadn't been so devastating. In the town of Walnut Grove, a Japanese-American farmer named Sugo Ikeda owned 90 acres of asparagus fields and a packing operation that employed 30 people during harvest season. He'd spent 18 years building the business from nothing. On March 10, 1942, he sold everything to his white foreman for $1,500. The foreman, who'd been trying to buy a partnership in the business for years and been refused, suddenly found himself the sole owner. He paid less than 10% of the operation's actual value and walked away with an asset that would generate profits for decades. Ikeda walked away with $1,500 bills in his pocket and instructions to report to the Stockton Assembly Center in 1 week. Mary Tsukamoto, a teacher in Florin, watched her parents sell their grape vineyard for a fraction of its worth. She later wrote, "We had to sell our piano, our furniture, everything we'd worked for. A man came to buy our pickup truck. It was almost new. He offered us $25. My father said, 'No, that's not enough.' The man shrugged and said, 'You leave in 3 days. What choice do you have?' We sold it to him. We needed the $25. The cruelty wasn't just in the prices. It was in the timing, in the systematic dismantling of any leverage the sellers might have had. First, the bank accounts were frozen. Japanese Americans couldn't access their own money to tide them over, couldn't use their savings to cushion the blow of forced sales. Second, the Federal Reserve Bank imposed a $100 limit on cash withdrawals, even from accounts that weren't frozen. Families who'd saved thousands or tens of thousands found themselves with access to only $100 while trying to relocate their entire lives. Third, the government announced there would be no storage facilities provided, no government assistance in protecting property, no guarantee of security for anything left behind. Sell or lose it Those were the options, and the buyers knew it. They came with cash and smiles, with sympathetic words and offers so low they were barely distinguishable from theft. But technically, legally, these were voluntary sales. The government wasn't seizing property. The government was simply removing the owners and letting market forces determine what happened next. That the market forces in question involved desperate sellers with days to close deals, and buyers who faced no competition made no difference in the eyes of the law. A sale was a sale. A contract was a contract. And if a man chose to sell his farm for 1/10 its value because armed soldiers were about to force him onto a bus, well, that was just unfortunate circumstances. Some families tried to hold out, tried to find other solutions. They approached white friends, people they'd known for years, asking them to hold property in trust until the war ended. Some agreed. A very few, actually honored those agreements and returned property after the war, but most did not. The temptation was too great, the legal protections too weak. A farmer in San Jose left his greenhouse operation in the hands of a long-time business associate, a white man he'd worked with for 15 years. The man promised to manage the business and return it when the war ended. When the farmer returned in 1946, he discovered the business had been sold, the property transferred through a series of legal maneuvers, and there was nothing he could do about it. His former associate shrugged and said, "Things changed. War changes things." Others tried to rent their property, rather than sell, hoping to return someday. But rents were set absurdly low, barely enough to cover taxes, and even those payments often stopped after a few months. What were the absent owners going to do? Sue from behind barbed wire? The legal system offered no meaningful recourse. Courts were unsympathetic at best, hostile at worst. Judges ruled consistently that the evacuation was legal, necessary, and any property transfers conducted under its shadow were valid. Some families tried to fight, tried to file suits, but lawyers wouldn't take their cases or charged fees they couldn't afford. The system was designed to protect property rights, but somehow it couldn't protect theirs. By April of 1942, over 110,000 Japanese Americans had been processed through assembly centers, temporary facilities set up at fairgrounds, racetracks, and exhibition halls. The Nakamura family was sent to the Tanforan Assembly Center, a horse racing track south of San Francisco. They arrived on buses, carrying their 8 suitcases and $4,500 in cash that Maz had sewn into the lining of his coat because he didn't trust anyone anymore, not even the government officials processing them. Tanforan was a glimpse into the absurdity and cruelty of what was happening. Families were assigned to live in horse stalls, actual horse stalls, barely cleaned, still reeking of manure and hay. The Nakamuras were given stall number 47, a space 12 feet by 20 feet that had housed 2 racing horses the month before. Now it would house 5 human beings. The walls were rough wood, gaps between the boards letting in wind and dust. There was no ceiling, just the underside of the roof. No furniture except canvas cots with metal frames and thin mattresses. No privacy. The stall doors didn't lock. They barely closed. Hana stood in the entrance of their new home and tried not to cry in front of her children. Little Tomo asked if this was where they would live now. "For a while," Ma said quietly. Just for a while. But he didn't know if he was telling the truth. No one had told them how long they'd be here or where they'd go next. The soldiers at the gates said nothing. The administrators processing paperwork said nothing. Everything was temporary, they were told, just a temporary measure until things get sorted out. But Maz looked at the barbed wire being strung around the perimeter, at the guard towers being constructed at each corner of the racetrack, at the machine guns being mounted to overlook the grandstands, and he understood that nothing about this was temporary. The living conditions were degrading in ways designed to break the spirit. Communal bathrooms with no partitions, no privacy. Mess halls where families ate in shifts, standing in long lines for food served on metal trays. The food itself was barely edible, heavy starches and mystery meats that bore no resemblance to what they'd eaten at home. Children who'd grown up eating fresh vegetables from their family farms now ate canned beans and stale bread. The elderly, accustomed to traditional Japanese diets, suffered digestive problems from the unfamiliar American institutional food. People lost weight. They got sick. The medical facilities were overwhelmed, understaffed, undersupplied. But worse than the physical conditions was the psychological weight of understanding what had been done to them. At night, lying on their cots in the darkness of the horse stall, families talked in whispers about what they'd left behind. The farms being harvested by new owners, the businesses operating under new management, the homes occupied by strangers. Letters began to arrive from the few white friends who hadn't turned predator, letters describing what was happening to their properties. The strawberries you planted are being picked. The store you built has a new sign out front. Your house is being rented to a family from Oklahoma. The letters were meant to be informative, maybe even comforting, but they read like obituaries. Everything they'd built was continuing without them, as if they'd never existed. Kenji Nakamura, 14 years old and trying to make sense of a senseless situation, started keeping a journal. In it, he wrote, "Today a man came through the camp buying things from people, watches, jewelry, anything valuable. He paid almost nothing, but people sold anyway, because what else can we do with this stuff? Where we're going next, we don't need watches. Mom sold her wedding ring for $8. It was worth at least $100, she cried after. Dad didn't say anything. He just looked away. I think he stopped being angry and started being sad. I don't know which is worse." By summer, the assembly centers began emptying as families were transferred to the permanent relocation centers. These were the camps, 10 of them scattered across the interior of the country, in some of the most remote and inhospitable locations the government could find. The Nakamuras were sent to Heart Mountain in Wyoming, a desolate stretch of high desert where summer temperatures reached 100 degrees and winter temperatures dropped to 20 below zero. The camp was surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers spread across a flat expanse of sagebrush, with the massive peak of Heart Mountain looming in the distance like a judge presiding over their imprisonment. The barracks at Heart Mountain were tar paper shacks, minimally insulated, divided into rooms that housed families of 6 or 7. Each room measured 20 feet by 25 feet. A single oil stove provided heat. There was no running water in the barracks. Communal bathrooms and showers were housed in separate buildings. During the brutal Wyoming winters, families had to dress and walk through snow and ice to use the facilities. The summer brought different miseries. Dust storms that blew through the gaps in the walls, coating everything in a fine brown powder. Scorpions and rattlesnakes that had to be shaken out of shoes every morning. And always the knowledge that they were being watched. Guards patrolled the perimeter 24 hours a day. Searchlights swept across the camp at night. Anyone who got too close to the fence was ordered back at gunpoint. The government called these relocation centers, but everyone inside knew what they really were. Concentration camps. That term was used at the time, even by government officials, before the full horrors of Nazi Germany's camps became known and made the phrase unutterable in polite American society. But that's what they were. Places where American citizens were imprisoned without trial, without charges, without any of the constitutional protections supposedly guaranteed by the Bill of Rights. The Supreme Court would later rule the internment constitutional, a decision that stands to this day as one of the court's most shameful moments, right alongside Dred Scott and Plessy v. Ferguson. Inside Heart Mountain, the Nakamura family tried to create some semblance of normal life. Maz found work in the camp's agricultural department, growing vegetables to feed the inner knees. The irony was savage. He'd been removed from his own farm as a security threat, then immediately put to work farming for the government that had imprisoned him. He was paid $16 a month, the standard wage for internee labor. Professional workers, doctors, and teachers earned $19 a month. Everyone else earned less. $16 a month for a man who'd once run an 80-acre farm that generated thousands in annual profit. Hana volunteered in the camp school, teaching children in classrooms with no books, no supplies, no proper desks. The children sat on whatever could be found, orange crates and scrap lumber, and learned from teachers who were themselves prisoners. Kenji attended high school behind barbed wire, played baseball in the dusty camp yard, and tried to forget that he'd once had a bedroom of his own, a dog, a bicycle, and a future that looked nothing like this. The letters that made it out of the camps carried a peculiar tone, a mixture of forced optimism and barely suppressed despair. Families wrote to friends and relatives still on the outside, trying to explain what couldn't really be explained. How do you describe the feeling of watching your life's work stolen while you're powerless to stop it? How do you put into words the humiliation of being imprisoned by your own government because of your face, your name, your ancestry? Some tried. Mary Tsukamoto wrote to a friend, "We are fine here, though the living conditions are not what we're accustomed to. We miss our home. We miss the vineyard. I hope someone is taking care of the vines. They'll need pruning soon. I wonder if whoever bought our property knows how to care for grapes." But most letters were more guarded, censored not just by the military officials who read all outgoing mail, but by the writers themselves, who couldn't quite bear to tell the full truth. To admit the full truth would be to acknowledge that they'd been defeated, stripped of everything, reduced to numbers in a barbed wire camp in the middle of nowhere. And some part of them still believed, had to believe, that this was temporary, that the war would end, justice would prevail, and they would return to their farms, their homes, their lives. That belief was all they had left. The government had taken everything else. While Japanese-American families ate in mess halls behind barbed wire in the desert, white farmers harvested the crops from their orchards, slept in their beds, and counted the profits from their labor. The war raged overseas, but on the home front, another kind of battle had already been lost. At Hart Mountain, the day began at 6 in the morning with a bell that clanged across the barracks, echoing off the mountain that gave the camp its name. The Nakamura family rose in the darkness of their small room, dressing quickly in the cold. There was no privacy, not even the illusion of it. Thin walls separated them from the family on one side, the family on the other. Every cough, every conversation, every moment of grief or anger was shared with strangers who were also trying to maintain some shred of dignity in undignified circumstances. Maz would pull on his work clothes, the same flannel and denim he'd worn on his farm, though now they hung looser on his frame. The food at Hart Mountain was filling but joyless, and everyone was losing weight. Hana would wake the children, helping little Tomo dress while Kenji and Yuki prepared themselves in silence. By 6:30, they'd be standing in line at the mess hall, metal trays in hand, waiting for scrambled eggs that tasted like powder and toast that was either burned or soggy. After breakfast, the family split. Maz walked to the agricultural section where he worked, Hana to the school where she taught, the children to their classes. Work and education, the camp administrator said, were essential to maintaining morale. But everyone understood the real reason. Idle prisoners were dangerous prisoners. Keep them busy, keep them tired, and they won't have time to organize, to protest, to fully comprehend the magnitude of what had been done to them. Maz spent his days in the camp gardens, coaxing vegetables from soil that didn't want to cooperate. The land around Hart Mountain was hostile to agriculture. High desert, alkaline soil, brutal temperature swings, and wind that never stopped. But Maz was a farmer, and farmers make things grow even when the land fights back. He showed the other internees how to amend the soil, how to design irrigation systems with limited water, how to protect tender plants from the Wyoming wind. By the second summer, they'd managed to produce enough vegetables to supplement the camp's food supply. Tomatoes, squash, beans, carrots. It was a small victory, a tiny assertion of control in a world designed to strip them of any control at all. But every time Maz's hands touched the soil, he thought about his farm in California, the 80 acres he'd worked for 20 years. He wondered if Bill Henderson was maintaining the irrigation system properly, whether he was pruning the pear trees at the right time, whether he understood that the strawberry fields needed to be rotated every 3 years or the soil would deplete. Probably not. Bill was a decent enough farmer, but he didn't have Maz's instincts, didn't know that land the way Maz knew it. The thought should have given Maz some bitter satisfaction. Instead, it just made him sad. That farm was dying slowly. He was certain of it. Maybe not this year or next, but eventually. And there was nothing he could do about it from behind barbed wire in Wyoming. Letters from California confirmed his fears. A former neighbor, one of the few white families who'd remained friendly, wrote to tell him that Bill Henderson was indeed struggling with the farm. The irrigation system had broken down, and Bill didn't know how to fix it. Some of the pear trees were showing signs of disease that could have been caught early but now had spread. The strawberry yields were down 40% from what Maz had produced. The letter was meant to be informative, maybe even supportive, but all it did was twist the knife. His farm was being mismanaged, declining in value and productivity, and he was powerless to stop it. In a few years, it would be worth half what he'd sold it for, and Bill Henderson, who'd paid $4,500 for a $40,000 property, would still come out ahead. Meanwhile, other properties were thriving under their new owners. In the Sacramento Valley, Japanese farms that had been purchased for pennies on the dollar were generating massive profits. White farmers who'd spent years complaining that Japanese competition was unfair suddenly found themselves running the most productive operations in the region. Funny how that worked. The land wasn't less productive. The climate hadn't changed. The only difference was who owned it and who got to keep the profits. Newspapers ran stories about the agricultural boom, how California was feeding America and its allies, how the war effort depended on the state's incredible food production. They never mentioned that much of that production came from land stolen from Japanese Americans. That detail was inconvenient, so it was forgotten. The psychological weight of this knowledge pressed down on everyone in the camps. They were watching their life's work continue without them, watching other people profit from their labor, and there was nothing they could do but endure. Some couldn't endure. In the first year of internment, suicide rates among Japanese Americans spiked. The elderly were especially vulnerable. Men and women who'd spent 50 or 60 years building something, only to see it taken away in a matter of days, found they had no reason to keep living. They would walk out into the desert and not come back. Or they'd simply stop eating, stop speaking, stop engaging with the world until they faded away. The camp hospitals recorded these deaths as natural causes, illness, heart failure. But everyone knew the real cause: broken hearts, stolen futures, despair. Then, in January of 1943, the government announced a new policy. Japanese American men would be allowed to volunteer for military service. The announcement was met with stunned disbelief. You imprison us without trial, steal our property, lock up our families, and now you want us to fight for you? The audacity was breathtaking. And yet, thousands volunteered. Young men like Kenji Nakamura, who'd just turned 16 but lied about his age to enlist. They volunteered for complicated reasons. Some believed it was the only way to prove their loyalty, to show that Japanese Americans were true patriots despite everything that had been done to them. Others saw it as a chance to escape the camps, even if escape meant being shot at in Europe. And some volunteered out of pure rage, channeling their anger into something that felt like action, like resistance, even though they'd be fighting for the country that had imprisoned them. The 4-4, 2-regimental combat team, became legendary, the most decorated unit in American military history for its size and length of service. Japanese American soldiers fought in Italy, France, and Germany with a ferocity born of having something to prove. They took casualties at rates that shocked even hardened military commanders. They rescued the Lost Battalion in France, saving over 200 Texan soldiers who'd been trapped behind enemy lines, fighting through German positions with a determination that bordered on suicidal. They earned over 18,000 individual decorations, including 21 Medals of Honor. And while they bled and died in European forests and Italian mountains, their families remained behind barbed wire in American deserts. The irony was not lost on anyone. Maz Nakamura read about his son's unit in the camp newspaper, stories of their bravery, their sacrifice. Kenji wrote letters when he could, describing Italy in terms that tried to downplay the danger, but couldn't hide the exhaustion, the fear, the reality of combat. In one letter, he wrote, "Dad, we're fighting for the country that took our farm. I know that sounds crazy, and maybe it is, but I think about it differently now. I'm not fighting for the government that locked you up. I'm fighting for the idea of what America is supposed to be. Maybe that's naive, maybe I'm a fool, but it's the only way I can make sense of wearing this uniform." Back at Heart Mountain, life settled into a grim routine. The camp was a city of 10,000 people, complete with schools, hospitals, a newspaper, churches, and even a police force made up of internees. People tried to create normalcy in abnormal circumstances. They formed baseball leagues, organized talent shows, held dances in the mess halls. Teenage girls made dresses from mail-order catalogs. Boys played sports in the dust. Families planted small gardens next to their barracks. It was an attempt to assert that they were still human, still alive, still capable of joy despite everything. But the wire was always there. The guard towers, the searchlights at night, the knowledge that they were prisoners, that their country had decided they were dangerous, based solely on their ancestry. Children born in the camps would later describe the cognitive dissonance of growing up behind barbed wire while being taught in school that America was the land of the free. Yuki Nakamura, 11 when she entered Heart Mountain, later wrote in her memoir, "I learned the Pledge of Allegiance in a classroom surrounded by barbed wire. I learned about the Constitution from teachers who were themselves denied constitutional rights. I learned that America was about liberty and justice for all while watching my mother cry at night because she'd lost everything. The education I received was not the one the teachers intended." The elders suffered most visibly. Men and women who'd arrived in America at the turn of the century, who'd spent 40 or 50 years building lives from nothing, found themselves reduced to living in tar paper shacks in the desert. They'd survived earthquakes and economic depressions, overcome language barriers and racial discrimination, turned barren land into productive farms. And for what? To die behind barbed wire, never seeing their homes again. Maz's father, Ichiro, who'd planted the first pear tree on the Nakamura farm in 1912, died at Heart Mountain in January of 1944. He was 73. The cause of death was listed as pneumonia, but Maz knew better. His father had died of heartbreak, of the knowledge that everything he'd built had been stolen, that the legacy he'd hoped to pass to his grandchildren was gone. They buried him in the camp cemetery, a plot of dirt marked with a wooden cross, miles from the California soil he'd spent his life cultivating. Yet even in grief, even in loss, the Japanese-American community found ways to resist the dehumanization of camp life. They maintained traditions, celebrated holidays, honored their dead with dignity. Buddhist priests conducted services in mess hall buildings. Christian ministers preached sermons about faith in the face of injustice. Families gathered to celebrate weddings, births, New Year's. The camp administrators allowed these gatherings, perhaps not realizing they were acts of quiet defiance. By maintaining their culture, their traditions, their sense of community, the internees were refusing to be broken. They were insisting that they were more than prisoners, more than security threats, more than the racist caricatures that had been used to justify their imprisonment. The camps also became places of unexpected education. With so many people confined together, skills and knowledge were shared freely. Professional artists taught painting and sculpture. Musicians gave lessons on traditional instruments. Scholars who'd been university professors before the war organized informal classes on everything from philosophy to engineering. For young people like Yuki Nakamura, the camps provided access to education from people they'd never have met otherwise. She studied calligraphy with a master from San Francisco, learned classical Japanese poetry from a woman who'd been a celebrated teacher in Los Angeles, studied biology from a man who'd been a research scientist before Pearl Harbor. The irony, she later reflected, was that she received a better education behind barbed wire than she would have in her rural California school. But education couldn't erase the fundamental injustice of their situation. As the months turned into years, the reality settled in. This was not temporary. They were not going home soon. The war dragged on, and the camps remained. By 1944, children who'd entered as babies were walking and talking, knowing nothing but camp life. Teenagers who'd been 12 or 13 were now old enough to graduate high school, their entire adolescence spent behind barbed wire. Adults who'd entered in their 30s were now in their 40s, years of their lives consumed by forced imprisonment. The toll was visible in faces that had aged faster than they should have, in the resignation that replaced the initial shock and anger. People stopped talking about when they'd go home and started talking about if they'd go home. Some didn't believe they ever would. Rumors circulated constantly. They're going to deport us all to Japan after the war. They're going to keep the camps open permanently. They're going to seize all our property officially, make the theft legal. These rumors were products of fear and trauma, but they weren't entirely irrational. After all, their government had already done the unthinkable. Who knew where it would stop? Maz Nakamura marked time by the seasons, 3 winters in Wyoming, 3 summers in the dust. He watched his children grow taller, watched his wife's hair turn gray, watched his friends and neighbors age and sicken and sometimes die. He worked in the gardens, attended services at the camp church, wrote letters to his son who was fighting in Italy. He went through the motions of living while feeling increasingly hollow inside. The farm he had lost haunted him. Not just the financial loss, though, that was devastating, but the loss of purpose. He'd been a farmer. That was his identity, his skill, his contribution to the world. And now he was nothing. A prisoner with a number. A security threat who grew tomatoes for his fellow prisoners. A man whose son was fighting and possibly dying for a country that had stolen everything from his family. In the spring of 1945, news began filtering into the camps that the war in Europe was ending. Germany surrendered in May. Celebrations erupted across America, but in the camps the mood was more complicated. Relief that the war was over, fear about what would happen next. Would they be released, allowed to return to California, or would the imprisonment continue under some new justification? The camp administrators offered no clear answers. Wait and see, they said. Decisions are being made at higher levels. Be patient, as if patience was something that could still be asked of people who'd already endured 3 years of unjust imprisonment. Then, in August, Japan surrendered. The war was truly over. And slowly, hesitantly, the government began making announcements about closing the camps. Internees would be released. They would receive $25 in cash and a train ticket to anywhere in the United States. They were free to go. But go where? Back to homes that were no longer theirs? To farms that had been sold? To communities that had cheered their removal? Freedom, it turned out, was more complicated than simply opening the gates. For the Nakamura family and thousands like them, the question wasn't just where to go. It was how to rebuild from nothing, how to start over at ages when they should have been enjoying the fruits of a lifetime of labor, how to explain to their children that the country that had imprisoned them was still somehow their home. The barbed wire would come down, the guard towers would be dismantled, but the damage done behind that wire would last generations. When the war ended, the government made an announcement. Japanese Americans were free to return home. But home was no longer home, and freedom came with no apology, no compensation, and no way to reclaim what had been stolen. November 1945. The Nakamura family stood at the gates of Heart Mountain with 8 suitcases, the same ones they'd arrived with 3 years and 8 months earlier. The camp was emptying slowly, families processing out in groups, receiving their final paperwork and their parting gift from the United States government, $25 in cash and a train ticket to anywhere in the country. Maz held the bills in his hand and almost laughed. $25. He had sold his farm for $4,500, which had seemed like theft at the time. Now the government was giving him $25 to restart his life, and apparently considered this generous. The train ride back to California was quiet. Tomo, now 9 years old, pressed his face against the window, watching the landscape change from Wyoming desert to California valleys. He'd been 6 when they left. He barely remembered the farm, barely remembered what life had been like before the wire. For him, the camp was normal. Freedom was the strange thing. Yuki, now 14, sat with her mother, both of them silent, lost in their own thoughts. Kenji wasn't with them. He was still in Europe with the 442, one of the lucky ones who'd survived but not yet discharged. Maz stared out the window at the farmland rolling past and felt nothing. Not hope, not fear. Just a hollow numbness that had settled into his chest somewhere around year 2 of the internment and never left. They arrived in Sacramento with no plan and nowhere to go. The farm was gone, obviously, but they didn't even have family to stay with. Hana's parents had been sent to a different camp and hadn't survived. Maz's father had died at Heart Mountain. His mother had gone to live with relatives in Colorado, too heartbroken to ever return to California. Friends they'd known before the war had scattered, some to other states, others to Japan. Others simply disappeared into the chaos of post-war America. The Nakamuras found a room in a boarding house in Japantown, a single room for the four of them, $10 a week. Maz found work as a day laborer in the fields he used to own land beside. 35 cents an hour, picking vegetables under the supervision of a white foreman, doing work he'd once hired others to do. One day, he decided to see the farm. He took a bus to the edge of the county and walked the last 3 miles, following roads he knew by heart. When he crested the small hill that overlooked his property, he stopped and stared. The farm was still there. The house still stood. The packing shed, the barn, even the windmill his father had built. But everything looked different, smaller somehow, shabbier. The irrigation system was indeed broken, just as he'd heard. Sections of the strawberry fields were overgrown with weeds. Some of the pear trees had died, dark skeletons among the green. But other parts of the operation were thriving. Bill Henderson had clearly focused on the most profitable sections and let the rest go to seed. Maz stood at the property line, not crossing onto land that had been his for 20 years. A truck pulled up, and Bill Henderson stepped out. They hadn't seen each other since the day Bill had counted out $4,500 on the hood of his truck. Bill looked older, thicker around the middle, comfortable. He saw Maz and walked over slowly. "Maz," he said, "heard you got out. Welcome back." Maz nodded, said nothing. "I've been running the place best I can," Bill continued. "It's good land. Your daddy knew how to pick a spot." "My daddy built that land," Maz said quietly. "Turned clay into soil, planted every tree." Bill shifted uncomfortably. "Yeah, well, war's over now. Things can get back to normal." "Normal," Maz repeated. He looked at Bill, at the farm behind him, at the life that had continued without him. "What's normal?" Bill didn't answer. After a long silence, he said, "If you're looking for work, I could use a hand during harvest. Pay's decent." The offer hung in the air. Maz could work on his own farm, for wages, for the man who'd bought it for a fraction of its worth. The absurdity was so complete it almost felt like a joke. He shook his head slowly. "No, thank you," he said, and walked away. He never went back. Across California, versions of this scene played out thousands of times. Japanese Americans returned to find their properties occupied, their businesses operating under new ownership, their homes lived in by strangers. Some tried to fight, hiring lawyers to challenge the sales. The courts were uniformly unhelpful. Judges ruled that the sales had been legal, that the buyers had purchased in good faith, that unfortunate circumstances didn't invalidate contracts. The fact that sellers had been under duress, had no access to their own money, had been given days to make decisions that would affect their entire lives, none of that mattered in the eyes of the law. A sale was a sale. A few families got lucky, a very few. There were white neighbors who'd held property in trust and actually honored their agreements. In San Jose, a flower grower named Takashi Hoshizaki returned from camp to find his greenhouse operation still intact. His neighbor, a man named Tom Smith, had managed the business for 3 years, keeping careful records of every penny earned and spent. When Hoshizaki returned, Smith handed over the keys, the books, and a check for the accumulated profits minus reasonable management fees. It was so rare, so exceptional, that newspapers wrote stories about it. Smith became briefly famous as an example of American decency. But his story was news precisely because it was the exception. Most Japanese Americans returned to find nothing. The Nakamura family struggled through the late 1940s. Maz worked whatever jobs he could find, mostly farm labor, occasionally construction. Hana took in sewing, mending clothes for people who barely paid her. The children went to school, but the experience was strange. Their classmates didn't know what to make of them. Where have you been? Why did you leave? The answers were too complicated, too painful. Often, the Nakamura children just shrugged and changed the subject. They learned not to talk about the camp, not to mention the farm, not to dwell on what had been lost. It became a family silence, a shared wound that no one wanted to touch. Kenji returned from the war in 1946, decorated and damaged. He'd survived Italy but come home with shrapnel scars and nightmares. He'd fought for a country that had imprisoned his family, and that contradiction had done something to him that no amount of medals could fix. He found work as a mechanic, married a girl he'd met before the war, and rarely spoke about his service. When people thanked him for his military service, he'd nod politely and say nothing. What was there to say? "You're welcome for fighting for the country that stole my family's farm and imprisoned us based on our race?" The bitterness was too deep for words. By 1950, the Nakamura family had achieved a kind of stability. They were surviving, but barely. They'd gone from prosperous farm owners to working-class poor in less than a decade. The wealth that should have passed to the next generation was gone. Kenji and Yuki would never inherit land. Their children would grow up in rented apartments, never knowing the feel of soil their grandfather had cultivated. The generational accumulation of wealth, the American dream of each generation doing better than the last, had been severed. 40 years of labor erased in 10 days of forced sales. And the silence about it all was deafening. Through the 1950s and 60s, Japanese Americans rarely spoke publicly about the internment. There was shame attached to it, an undeserved but powerful sense that they'd done something wrong, that their imprisonment was somehow their fault. Children who'd been in the camps often didn't tell their own children. The camps became a kind of family secret, mentioned in whispers, if at all. The rest of America was happy to forget. The internment was rarely taught in schools, rarely mentioned in history books. It was an inconvenient truth, evidence that America was capable of the same kind of racial scapegoating and mass imprisonment that it condemned in other countries. Decades passed. The Issei generation, the immigrants who'd built the farms and businesses, died off one by one, most having never recovered what they had lost. Maz Nakamura died in 1973, working as a groundskeeper at a public park. He was 70 years old and had spent the last 28 years of his life in jobs far beneath his skills and experience. At his funeral, Kenji gave a brief eulogy. He didn't mention the farm. He didn't mention Heart Mountain. He kept his remarks short and factual. His father had been a hard-working man, a loving father, a person of dignity. What he didn't say, what everyone in the room knew, was that his father had died still angry, still carrying the weight of injustice that had never been acknowledged, never been addressed, never been made right. But by the 1980s, something was shifting. Younger Japanese Americans, the Sansei generation, began asking questions their parents and grandparents had been too traumatized to ask. Why did this happen? Who was responsible? What happened to the property? Their questions sparked a movement. Activists, historians, and community leaders began pushing for redress, for an official acknowledgement of what had been done. They gathered testimonies from survivors, compiled economic analyses of the losses, built a case that the internment had been not just wrong, but catastrophically unjust. The political battle was long and difficult. Many Americans didn't want to acknowledge the internment at all, or they defended it as a wartime necessity. But the evidence was overwhelming. In 1983, a congressional commission concluded that the internment had been the result of race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership, not military necessity. The commission recommended an official apology and monetary compensation for survivors. 5 years later, in 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act. The law formally apologized for the internment and provided $20,000 in reparations to each surviving internee. It was a meaningful gesture, a recognition that wrong had been done. Kenji Nakamura, by then 60 years old, received his check in 1990, $20,000. He stared at it for a long time. His family's farm had been worth at least $40,000 in 1942. Adjusted for inflation, that would be over $700,000 in 1990 dollars. The farm had generated income for decades. Had his family kept it, invested the profits, maintained the property, it would have been worth well over $1 million. $20,000 was an insult dressed up as justice. But it wasn't really about the money. It was about acknowledgement, about the government finally admitting that what had been done was wrong. For survivors, that acknowledgement mattered. Many wept when they received their letters of apology. Not because $20,000 made up for what they had lost, but because after nearly 50 years, someone had finally said, "This should not have happened, and we are sorry." Yet the land never came back. The farms, the businesses, the houses, all of it remained in the hands of those who'd bought it for pennies on the dollar or their descendants. There were no provisions in the Civil Liberties Act for returning property or even for compensating families for the full value of what had been stolen. The reparations were symbolic, not restorative. Japanese Americans never recovered their pre-war economic position. Before World War II, they'd been a prosperous community controlling significant wealth in agriculture and business. After the war, they had to start over from zero, and the economic gap never closed. In 2005, Kenji's grandson, David Nakamura, decided to visit the farm his great-grandfather had built. He was 25, a graduate student studying history, writing a thesis on the internment. He drove out to the Sacramento Valley, following directions his grandfather had given him reluctantly, painfully. The farm was still there, still operating, now owned by the Henderson family's third generation. David parked on the side of the road and looked out over the fields. There was a historical marker near the entrance, installed by the county in the 1990s. It read, "This land was part of a thriving Japanese-American agricultural community before World War II. Many families were forced to sell their properties during the internment period. We remember their contributions to California agriculture." David read the plaque and felt anger rise in his throat. Forced to sell was such gentle language for what had actually happened. Theft. That was the word. Legal. Theft, systematic theft, government-sanctioned theft, but theft nonetheless. He thought about his great-grandfather, a man he'd never met, who'd built this farm from nothing. He thought about his grandfather, who'd fought in Europe while his family was imprisoned. He thought about all the wealth that should have been his inheritance, all the stability and opportunity that came with generational property ownership, and how all of it had been taken in 10 days in February 1942. A truck pulled up, and a man in his 40s stepped out. This was the current Henderson, Bill's grandson, a man who'd inherited land his grandfather had bought for $4,500 and was now worth several million. He approached David with a polite but cautious expression. "Can I help you?" he asked. David gestured at the plaque. "My family used to own this land. My great-grandfather built this farm." Henderson's expression shifted, becoming uncomfortable. "Oh? Yeah, I've heard about that. It's unfortunate what happened back then." "Unfortunate," David repeated. "That's one word for it." Henderson shifted his weight. "Look, I understand you might have complicated feelings, but my family bought this land legally. We've paid taxes on it for 60 years. We've worked it, improved it. This is our property now." And there it was, the fundamental impasse, legally purchased, good faith buyers, property rights, all the language that had been used in 1942 and was still being used now. The theft had been made legal, and once something is legal, once it's sanctioned by courts and contracts and time, it becomes almost impossible to undo. David nodded slowly. "I know," he said. "I'm not here to take anything from you. I just wanted to see it, to stand where my great-grandfather stood." Henderson relaxed slightly. "If you want, I can show you around. There are still some of the original trees, the ones your great-grandfather planted." They walked the property together, an awkward pairing. Henderson pointed out the old growth pear trees, now nearly 100 years old, gnarled and still producing. He showed David the original foundation of the packing shed. He talked about the challenges of modern farming, water rights, labor costs, market pressures. And David listened, understanding that Henderson wasn't the villain of the story. He was just a man who'd inherited stolen goods without understanding their provenance. The real villains were dead or had been government officials carrying out policies shaped by racism and greed. Before David left, he stood one more time at the edge of the fields and took a photograph. He didn't know why. What was he trying to capture? Evidence of something that couldn't be recovered? Proof of loss? A connection to a past he'd never experienced? He thought about the cost of what had been done, not just the financial cost, though that was staggering. Japanese Americans had lost an estimated $2 to $6 billion in property. And income over the course of the internment, money that had never been recovered, wealth that had never passed to subsequent generations. But beyond the dollars was something harder to quantify. The psychological cost, the lost sense of belonging, the broken trust. The knowledge that your citizenship, your rights, your property, all of it could be taken away based solely on your ancestry. As David drove away, he thought about his grandfather, now in his 80s, still living in a modest apartment in Sacramento, still working part-time at a hardware store because his retirement savings were inadequate. He thought about what his grandfather's life could have been if the farm had never been stolen, the education he could have afforded, the opportunities he could have provided his children, the wealth that could have passed down through generations, the way it had for the Henderson family. All of that had been taken. And $20,000 in reparations, while meaningful, hadn't come close to making it whole. This is American history, David thought as he merged onto the highway. Not a mistake, but a choice. Not an accident, but a system. The theft was legal. The internment was constitutional. The courts upheld it. The government sanctioned it. And the land never came back. 120,000 people imprisoned without trial. Billions of dollars in property stolen. Generational wealth erased. And the country had moved on, mostly forgotten about it, filed it away as an unfortunate chapter in the past. But for families like the Nakamuras, it wasn't the past. It was the present. It was every month of struggling to pay rent instead of collecting rent. It was every generation starting from zero instead of building on the previous generation's foundation. It was the compounding cost of injustice, growing larger with each passing year, never acknowledged, never repaid. The war had ended in 1945, but for Japanese American families, the battle to recover what was taken, to reclaim even a fraction of what they had lost, continued still. And most had long ago accepted a bitter truth. They would never get it back. The land was gone. The wealth was gone. And all that remained was the story, passed down through generations, a reminder of how quickly freedom could be stripped away, how easily prosperity could be stolen, and how the law could be used not to protect the vulnerable, but to legitimize their destruction.